We are on the cusp of a renaissance in the West. The Dark Age we are now experiencing, as with all previous Dark Ages, is a transitional period and will pass if men and women work together collectively to bring about the required change. The fall of the Bronze Age Mycenaean civilization ultimately led to the rise of classical Greek culture, which in turn inspired the resurgence of classical learning during the 14th century after the medieval Dark Age. History once again repeats itself. Now is the time for a 21st century Renaissance. The first part of this video is a full explanation of not just how this will happen, but why it must and will, using my mentors, Steve and Pauline Richards' psychosystems analysis, and their original syncretism between the work of Carl Jung, Dr. Rupert Sheldrake, Sir Roger Penrose, Charles Darwin, and Plato. Everything spoken by me comes directly from Steve and Pauline's 43 years each of frontline clinical experience. The second part of this video is a dialectic between myself and Steve and Pauline, discussing what the rebirth of the West will look like in each individual person who refuses to give in to the catabolism and takes the side of true human potential. To have a chance of reversing our cultural decline, we first need to understand it. At first glance, our biology, psychology, and the culture can appear to be separate phenomena. But you'll know already if you've seen the rest of the videos in this series, this is not the case. Every describable dimension of the human experience is superpositioned with one another within a nested continuum of information. Information is that which informs. It is the fundamental substrate of everything. At the base and outside of the continuum is thus informational monism. This informational monism is superpositioned across the entirety of the continuum to form the objective waveform of information. Note, this is not the wave function of quantum mechanics, which describes the behaviour of particles. This is different and more fundamental in terms of resolution, as the complete waveform of information. The subjective waveform, on the other hand, of individual reflexive, self-referent, psychological consciousness is the collapse of the objective waveform into immediate subjective awareness. Subjective consciousness is the representation of information to itself at the subjective conscious level. In the animation on screen, you can see this waveform pulse, move, and shift in amplitude. This is because its contents instantiate subjectively and dynamically out from the objective waveform of the field of informational monism by dynamically superpositioning its contents into representational states. This local collapse of the objective waveform into subjective representation is regulated both by the field overall and by the principle and dynamics of homeostasis locally to that subjective collapse. The objective waveform is unaffected by any specific subjective waveform collapse, representing an individual's reflexive ego consciousness. A useful way of modelling this is through the use of a principle first used by Professor George Engel, the founder of the biopsychosocial medical model, who personally supported Steve and Pauline's development of psychosystems analysis. Where you think you stand determines what you think you see. Put simply, what you see is always conditional on factors influencing ego consciousness. That is, where you think you stand. For example, if someone has a purely psychological view of the human experience, their subjective waveform would look something like this. If it is purely biomedical, it would look instead like this. The same is true for everyday experience. If we modify the variables shown on screen to show the 4 qualia of ego consciousness, then the objective waveform has representation in all of them: cognitive, affective, sensory, and somatic information, all informing the ego at large. A subjective waveform collapse into only, for example, cognition, thus limits what reflexive ego consciousness can be aware of, out of the totality of the information available to it. It is important to note that the subjective waveform is only ever a localized collapse of the objective waveform, and hence, as mentioned earlier, the objective waveform is unaffected by any specific subjective collapse. Informational monism is projected, using that word metaphorically, into superposition with the material universe, at the resolution of the Planck scale, the smallest dimension of space-time geometry. This fundamental field of information is called the Platonic field. This is the meta-field of the objective waveform, the ontological, organizing, and informing field of superpositioning information. Famously, as the founding substrate of Western philosophy, Plato spoke about his intuitive world of forms. A priori to the physical world of the senses, there existed the perfect template for everything we can see and experience. He used many examples to illustrate this point, from truth to justice to what is good, and even physical objects. Put simply, there is an essence of something which we cannot see, that is nonetheless essential for informing the nature of that something. Plato developed this idea through the use of both intuition, as might be understood in a Jungian sense, and feeling, or more appropriately, affect. Or in other words, he did not begin with cognition. He intuited it and felt it. Then, through the figure of Socrates in his dialogues, he included the logic of cognition to bolster his case. This model has been challenged over the centuries through the Western, more scientifically inclined mind. We cannot literally see this so-called world of forms through controlled experiment, and thus it cannot exist. However, in recent decades, some notable scientists have challenged this assertion. Sir Roger Penrose has intuited something very similar to Plato, that, metaphorically, mathematics exists as if in its own world, separate but interactive with the material world and the world of the mind. You cannot see mathematics, but its explanatory power for everything we can observe is so incredibly precise, it must be the case that maths is clearly real, albeit not in a material sense. This becomes of immense practical consideration when we attempt to fully describe and explain the material world. As Penrose has stated, elementary particles, like electrons and quarks, are best described as that which satisfies the Dirac equation. We cannot satisfactorily describe them in any other physical way. In other words, there comes a point when the essence of a discrete entity can only be described by appealing to something that appears to be, as if, outside of the material world altogether. Steve and Pauline's concept of the Platonic field thus includes essential syncretism from both Plato and Sir Roger Penrose. It is the preeminent organising field of information, that which informs everything within space-time. The Platonic field distills and instantiates through increasing complexity into both the physical, ontological fields corresponding to the elementary particles and the formative causation morphic fields identified by Dr. Rupert Sheldrake. In this first type of field, the information organises through increasing complexity from elementary particles, like quarks and electrons, into hadrons, that is protons and neutrons, atoms, and then molecules. This, of course, is the domain of chemistry and physics. We may imagine these to be discrete structures, and they are, but more technically, each elementary particle is an excitation in its individual field, as modelled by quantum field theory. The further organisation of carbon-based organic chemistry gives rise to biochemistry, before, of course, molecular and organismic biology. A person is thus a physical entity and a composite nested series of excitations of the underlying ontological quantum fields. We know from the work of Dr. Rupert Sheldrake that the dynamic activity of these physical fields is noted within a nested hierarchy of morphic fields, inextricably linked with the physical, and influences the future activities of these fields through formative causation. Sheldrake has described this as if there were an inherent memory present in the material world. This includes behavioural fields of a whole organism, which is nested within a superpositioned hierarchy of requisite morphic fields, representing a nested resolution of what we could call consciousness. To explore this essential point, we first need to define consciousness. Steve and Pauline have done so through consideration of homeostasis as both a principle and a dynamic. When considering a field of informational representation that has one or more foci organised as systems, exactly that which is described thus far, then the regulation of and between those systems can be said to fulfill the criteria for being conscious, a complexity of information that represents itself to itself. Consciousness in this sense thus does not mean reflexive ego consciousness with phenomenological awareness. Instead, it is a fundamental definition of the mechanical dynamics which stack through nested complexity to produce ego consciousness, but through appeal to phylogeny is not limited to it. We might consider the simplest form of consciousness within physical nature to be the genome, when in its biological context. It's both a complexity of information, as per a superpositioned instantiation of the information of the Platonic field, and it represents itself to itself, again when in its context. It can replicate, and it can interact with the environment depending on its quote-unquote needs, using that word metaphorically, through dynamically altering its global transcription profile via epigenetic factors. There is thus a non-phenomenological proto-form of consciousness to the genome, operating certainly algorithmically as if it had an intentionality. The information composing the genome and its associated fields is superpositioned with the rest of biology and its psychodynamics, and as complexities of information that represent themselves to themselves, each discrete layer of the psychosystem's continuum can be said to fulfill the criteria for being, quote-unquote, conscious. And so too can the entirety of the objective waveform of information. This includes, crucially, as localized representations, the Panksepian instincts and the meta-instincts, and their associated Sheldrakean behavioural fields. They are all conscious. So the Platonic field instantiates and distills into the complexities of the material world. By the time consciousness as information has migrated from telic ontogenesis, from Platonic qualia, through inanimate matter, to biology, and then psychology, all superpositioned together, then we begin to see important Sheldrakean field effects, behavioural and morphic resonance, and the interaction between field and genome to generate meta-instincts, and the apperception of the representation of Platonic information. such as, for example, the aforementioned Platonic forms of both the masculine and the feminine, which we discussed earlier in this series. Over the course of phylogenetic time, the Platonic field has instantiated itself through representation in biology, via the Darwinian laws of preservation. This is key. In previous videos in this series, we've discussed how our cultural catabolism can be acutely explained through Steve and Pauline's Freud-Adler-Jung equation. Freud seeks Adler. Adler conceals Freud. Jung inflates and falls victim to both. Because we live in a physical world ruled by Darwin, the collective genome needs to be very sensitive to superpositioned homeostasis. Through a trickster dynamic, a function of homeostasis, the collective genome, through the interaction of its physical and Sheldrakean fields, is currently shit-testing the population. For people caught in this field, meta-instincts are largely switched off, and the Panksepian instincts fire forward narcissistically to meet baseline Darwinian needs. These corrupted instincts, Freud, seek satiation in the social world, Adler. Thus, Freud seeks Adler. The psychosocial behaviour conceals the instincts driving their teleology. Adler conceals Freud. At a certain threshold, as is most obviously visible in some contemporary world leaders, the Darwinian instinctive pressure completely takes over the personality. Jung inflates. But behind this is always Adler and Freud. Jung inflates and falls victim to both. Ultimately, standing behind this trickster dynamic is Darwin. It's difficult to look at, but the inevitable teleology is a drastic decline in the world's population. This would be the terminal lucidity of the West. For a rebirth of the West, however, Steve and Pauline have a second formula, one that involves going right back behind Jung, Adler and Freud to the fundamentals of the Platonic field, and its quote-unquote conscious intentionality. Plato seeks Darwin. Darwin conceals Plato. The soul transcends and unites them both. As mentioned a moment ago, over the course of phylogenetic time, the Platonic field has instantiated itself through representation in biology via the Darwinian laws of preservation. It must do this, as we are, after all, in a world of matter. Any superpositioning of its information must be done physically. Superpositioned, informed matter, from molecules up to cells, and certainly the resolution of organisms, compete with one another for literal existence. Thus, Plato seeks Darwin. What we see, however, is usually just the Darwinian dynamics. At the molecular level, the so-called laws of the universe dictating what will exist within a system resolved across time, and at the organismic level, which individuals will survive. Thus, Darwin conceals Plato. One could then see Freud, Adler and Jung resolve out from this, leading to where we are as a culture today, but always behind Darwin is Plato. To restore the Platonic would be the Renaissance of the West. Meta-instincts have developed through evolution to self-regulate the ontology of Platonic forms into material reality. They are both superpositioned physical and Sheldrakean dynamics, resolved out across phylogeny from the Platonic field. Or, in other words, the informational substrate of the genome and its associated fields is the Platonic telic intentionality of the lifespan. The meta-instincts are, as Steve has said, the dreams of the genome, directed by field dynamics that are only apprehended by intuition in that Platonic sense. Their activation within the lives of individuals downregulates immediate Darwinian pressure in favour of the instantiation and release of the full bandwidth of human potential, as the teleology of the nested ontological organisation of the Platonic field. Hence, the final part of the formula. The soul transcends and unites them both. One second more. Do you want to do a hello part?
Yeah, I'll do a hello.
Okay.
Thank you, James.
You ready, Paul?
Just because we've already said hello, so to say hello again, it just feels strange.
What do you say after you say hello? And that's a book. That's a book on transactional analysis by Eric Byrne, MD. What do you say after you say hello? So I'll say hello and then pass that over to you about what to say next. Hello, James.
Hello, James.
Hello, Steve and Pauline. Hello.
Hi.
One of the things that stuck out to me from our recent conversations across the terminal lucidity and the rebirth is sometimes it can feel quite dark looking at what's going on in as much stark detail as possible. And obviously sometimes that can be very unpleasant. But something that gives me a lot of hope, and this comes from your guys' model of the field that was explained in the intro, is there is no lack of hope. The field literally intends for everything to get better. And that's looking at things from obviously a human point of view, but from an informational monism point of view, obviously that's simply the way that the field acts. And then I was reminded of Jung's concept of enantiodromia. And it seems like in enantiodromia, things flipping back the other way can be explained very nicely through your guys' model of the field. So things are really bad at the moment, but because of a mismatch in the Platonic element that's instantiated right now in our culture, it will push back the other way, just as almost like a law of the universe, if I've got that right.
Yes, and that is happening. But it's not differentiating itself out fully yet, because there are still catabolic elements at work. But definitely, and for some time now, I think we've seen the beginnings of that change taking root. Firstly, in individuals. And as we said before in the other videos, that's the essential starting point, is with individuals. And then collectively, through Sheldrakean dynamics, the same kind of ideas will start to appear apparently at random in other groups, other populations around the world in preparation for that switch in the field. So it's like the Earth's magnetic field. Before it flips, there's a period of chaos where it oscillates quite wildly, and we're in that oscillation period now. If catabolism was stable, it would be, and there would be no opposition to it, and the drive would be down, completely down, and everybody would be agreeing with it, but everybody is not agreeing with it. There was a collective agreement that was sufficient for it to gain momentum, but there will come a necessary point at which the field will flip. And that's the most chaotic time. And it's a time when at first individuals will start to show in different places with different ideas on the surface, but deep down they'll be very similar. And then the Sheldrakean factor will kick in fully, and we'll start to see that change taking place.
It seems as part of this oscillation period, there are lots of proposed solutions to more or less what we could call a rebirth of the West that are out there. Some of them focus on a much more sort of collective sense of identity, which has never felt right to me personally. It feels like you're sort of sacrificing something very fundamental. But there's also lots of ideas around, I could almost call it, I think, self-denial and self-immolation, as if everything is somehow every individual's fault. But obviously with a Sheldrakean field model, that kind of thinking, that kind of assessment as to what's going on isn't required and isn't accurate, because it would simply be people living out the way their lives should have been and not be pulled into the field, rather than have to sort of take on everything on their own shoulders. That seems like a very trickster, nasty trickster dynamic that would pull a lot of people down in a very sort of covert way. Yeah. So just as the culture's going down, other people then start to, as we've spoken about in this series, essentially self-delete through self-denial in whatever way that happens to take shape. So with a Sheldrakean field model, then would it be accurate to say that the most fundamental thing that everybody can do, and this will probably feel very right, is simply to not quite ignore what's going on out in the culture, but don't sacrifice anything about yourself and who you should be to what's going on in the culture?
Yeah, as you know, James, Sheldrake in a field sense is the interface between the Platonic and the materiality that manifests biologically and psychosocially. So in that sense, then, we have Sheldrake and Darwin operating simultaneously, and they may appear to be contradictory to one another, but they're not. And in this sense, then, the kind of challenge that people call a shit test will and has emerged at the level of Darwin and at the level of the Sheldrakean field. And if people can resist that, then the enantiodromia will move very positively but firmly away from the negative and the catabolic, which it's been heading in that direction, particularly in the West for some time. So those people who feel under collective pressure to adopt a negative Sheldrakean field are actually being challenged by that field to resist it. It's the only way that you can actually get Darwinian dynamics to work at the level of biology with any hope that they will reverse. Because once people otherwise accept the negative, then the whole population would collapse into self-deletion, and that would be it. Now, clearly, that's not in the interest of the genome. So there will be a period of time, and there's an analogy here with a neurosis, for example, where things get really, really bad. And that is a kind of a pressure test to see whether we will resist it or not and whether we can bounce back. So that operates at the level of the individual, and it operates at the level of a culture. And the fundamental drive behind that is Darwinian, because in order to recover the ground, in order to bring about positive growth and development for the whole species, culturally and biologically, then it has to be faced with the potential for an ultimate challenge. Now, that's an awful thing, obviously, if we adopt the wrong kind of mindset towards it. So we're not suggesting at all that people should be Pollyanna about this, which is not the way. The way is not cognitive, in other words. It's moving into a sense of affect, which is instinct, that connects directly with the genome and with the fields of the genome, which are Sheldrakean. And what their intentionality is for readjusting and moving out in a positive direction. It's the way evolution has always occurred. It's the way that cultures have evolved and have risen and have fallen and have transformed. So once we have that perspective, then we can be active, conscious participants in that process and not merely victims. So if we're feeling like we are victims, that is the challenge, to see which of us will make that switch. So yeah, it's very much a Sheldrakean thing, and Sheldrake is immanent within biology.
I'm just listening to what you're saying, Steve, and I'm wondering, in a way, who our message is for, in the sense that there will be different groups of people. There will be people who, in terms of maybe their own potential, have a very modest potential, and in that sense are very much part of the collective and open to suggestion and influence. And so they're moved around by these tidal forces which are going on. And then there'll be another group of people who will see this as being almost purely an academic issue, something to think about, as you say, to approach with cognition, so that it's just an idea.
Yeah.
And then there'll be a huge bandwidth of people in between who do understand sufficiently what we're saying to not only partake on an individual level, but to make an active contribution as an individual to the field, which will bring about the change, the enantiodromia that we're looking for.
Yeah.
So in that sense, I think we've got a large demographic of people who are sufficiently aware and understanding of what we're discussing now in order to actively take part in this, but to also understand that they are literally just a part. They are an individual that is part of a much bigger force. And that I actually personally find that massively reassuring from my own perspective, for the reasons that you said. That say when somebody does have a mental or psychological breakdown, or what we might refer to, if we use the Greek word katabasis, they literally hit rock bottom. You know, when you're working with somebody like that, you know that that is a turning point for them. Although the seeds of their change were there all along individually, that you can actually start to rebuild at that point, that that person is going to ultimately start to transform themselves and fulfill their genomic potential. But if you can help them to understand that there are also forces at work that will bring about that change, such as the genome and their genomic potential, and also beyond that, the platonic field as well, then it's as if you're not, it's as if you're not making that change from the perspective of the ego. There is something much bigger, much greater, much deeper than you as an individual, which will bring that about. And that's true on an individual level. It is true on a cultural level. And I think just that idea is massively reassuring. It certainly gives people hope who have psychological breakdowns, when they understand that the solution goes beyond their ego's understanding of what they need to do. And then very often, once they accept the affect and the meaning of that, you know, that just it bottoms out into something so powerful that they transform. And they transform from within. And I think the seeds for change now are there in the culture, just like they've been across history and other time periods. You know, for example, at the end of the Age of Reason, the Enlightenment, the seeds for the Romantic period were already there, were already forming. You could see that enantiodromia waiting to happen, and it's the case now. It may feel as if we're on the verge of a dark age, and in some ways we are, but it doesn't mean that we have to, you know, fall head first into that. I think it is possible to create that shift, to create that enantiodromia, by being an active participant now, right now, at this time, and then we can bring that about collectively.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, completely agree. James, do you have anything to offer at this point before we continue?
I thought that was excellent, and I had a point I wanted to raise. I think that dovetails with that, because Steve, I'm reminded of a video or two videos you shared on Discord, and you were talking with some of the guys on our Discord server very recently, from the ancient Indian text. Forgive me if I forget the name of it.
The Mahabharata.
Oh yes,
that's the one. Now that was fascinating to watch. I'm very, very familiar with, let's say, Western European tradition and mythology and stuff like that. I'm not so much with Hindu. So hearing what was coming out of that particular video matches an awful lot, let's say, through dialectic or syncretism, some of the conversations that we've been having recently. So there was an instant resonance there, especially in this context when the voice from the lake was saying, I always act, I am action. And that's another thing that you guys have said too about the karma yoga, the right action. And that ties in with Sheldrake too. So what I see superpositioned up and down and reciprocal all the way through is you've got the platonic field, Sheldrake, and biology. And the key point is you need to act. Once you act in a positive way, so in other words, Pauline, when you're saying not just being cognitive and academic, you act, that influences the Sheldrakean field, and that keeps, in a way, or will keep the positive platonic element around. And then as Sheldrake spreads around, more of that platonic can then come through. So it then won't be a stark shift or click necessarily where there's like a sustained neurosis between one side versus the other. It's a natural shift as collectively as the distribution of that platonic field will just naturally resort itself in line with superpositioned homeostasis. So I just thought that was interesting too, Steve, because you raised that those two videos on Discord the other day.
I did, and thank you for reminding me about that, James. I highly recommend a study of Indian culture. It is, without question, the bridge between the East and the West, and it's more accessible to a Western mind than the Eastern mind. And I've been involved in the Eastern traditions, I should say Chinese principally, and Tibetan for 50 years. And I still think, even after all of that time and the depth that I've been involved in it, that the Indian Dharma, and I mean really the Hindu, even more than the Buddhist, is that which is potentially that which can help to cure the West from outside of itself. And I don't really mean that necessarily in a religious sense, and I wouldn't reduce it to the banality of calling it philosophy. But I would say that there is something so deeply meaningful in what they convey, particularly in the Mahabharata, that we can all learn from it. We can learn from its simplicity, but also its immense depth. And in those two videos, you'll see elements that were repeated by Carl Jung thousands of years after the Mahabharata was first put into written form. So yeah, karma yoga, the yoga of right action, and the teachings that come through that. It's an amazing experience, and I would recommend that people look up Peter Brook and his version of the Mahabharata. It's on YouTube. It's five and a half hours long, but it's worth going through in great detail. You will see diversity in there. You will see all of the races, all of them treated as equal, but all of them interacting as one humankind, negatively and positively, and working their way through their lifespan development as individuals and as cultures, and what they will encounter naturally enough, going through that process, including the dark side of themselves and everything else. You'll find so much in there. It's of so much value. Highly recommend it. There is something in there for the West now, without a doubt. And of course, the bridge to India from the West in historical times was Hellenism, which was started by Alexander. And the cross-fertilization between Greece and India brought immense riches intellectually into the world, and spiritually too. That's something that we have forgotten, and I think that's a great loss.
Thank you. As I say, it's particularly the part that stood out to me was the action line.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people do, and I understand why people might be inclined to do this, because it's easy to do it. It's scary to do the contrary, and it's very uncomfortable to do the contrary. But to sit and think and to treat things as a very introverted experience just allows complexes to take control over the ego, and then it's loop cognition, and it's all these different ideas, and those ideas can spiral into a sense of doom and gloom. But if there's something you can learn from history, maybe one of the main things from history is that nothing ever got done until people started to act on it. Yes. And there's definitely a Sheldrakean element there, and beneath that there's a Platonic element in there.
Yeah,
it's almost like the substrate, if you like, the field substrate behind the information that's present within Sheldrake. Yeah. That seems to be true whenever you look at any event within history. People act decisively with courage, and it's as if that courage sometimes comes from a place that's, as you were suggesting, Pauline, there's a lot outside of the ego that's there to back us all up.
It says that in the Mahabharata as well.
It does, absolutely.
You have Krishna saying that there is an intelligence beyond the mind.
Yeah.
And the mind that he was talking about was the ego. The intelligence beyond it, we could call it in Western sense the unconscious, but it was more than that. It was something in a field sense. And it was the field in the form of the Dharma, the teaching that spoke out from the lake. And of course, as an aside, there was a connection there of the cauldron of rebirth in Celtic mythology, because the lake brought back to life those that had fallen once the Dharma had been accepted. And there were questions too, the kind of questions you get in the Grail Castle in the Western tradition. The hero was asked questions, and when the Dharma was satisfied, the Dharma took on the form of the water in the lake. It then became a form of rebirth for all of those that had fallen. So they were the Grail questions. in another culture. So the deep structure between them is the most important thing. So it's not the Grail Castle and the Grail Question, and it's not necessarily the Mahabharata. It's what unites them both, which is the deeper structure. The thing is, what can get us there most easily? Do we follow the superficialities of how an Arthurian presentation is given these days via the internet and movies? Do we do it by following an Eastern religion? Or do we find another way, which is somehow both, which is individual, but collective in the sense that once we access that, we are in a field resonant state with others who on the surface seem to be different to us, but they are not. And that's another message from the Mahabharata. When Krishna speaks to the hero Arjuna, when he's about to fail before the battle essentially was a collective neurosis. All of the races of humankind were present and were about to destroy one another. They're all there. The diversity is there. He's presented with paradox, because paradox and opposition, they're the seedbed for neurosis. What creates it? And he taught Arjuna how to transcend polarity through action, not through contemplation alone, though contemplation was a part of it. It was contemplate to understand the deepest structures of all. Krishna reveals himself in his universal form. Now, dialectical syncretism would tell you that that's the Platonic form of what Krishna represents. Krishna is an avatar of Vishnu. So even as he appears there, he is still not the only form that he can appear in. That's the meaning of avatars in the Hindu Dharma. It's really a monotheistic religion, Hinduism. And they're all projections of one intelligence, which is beyond the mind. And the connection there clearly was that there was a Platonic form that could be accessed that would transcend everything, but only through action as well as contemplation. But it has to be delivered into the world through action. So if we can go inside and access what we would call meta instincts and those fields which surround them and embed them, then there will be a harmonic resonance with others who think in a completely different way on the surface, but we are all deeply connected. And it's at that level that the field kicks in.
That's actually true diversity, Steve, culturally.
Yes, it
isn't
is.
it? Really, because it's a true acceptance of difference, because there's that unification of humankind at that deep level. And the kind of diversity that we're exposed to now is actually a desiccation. It's not true diversity at all, although, you know, we're persuaded of that by the culture. But what you're describing, Steve, it is a way literally of plumbing the depths of human nature, of humankind, and seeing the unification, as you said before, of all races, because that is where we are connected.
Yeah, absolutely, Paul. And at a relatively superficial level, from a Western perspective, the East would think of it this way: Jung's collective unconscious would be superficial because it's still populated by individual reified characters. We're not at the pure base level yet when we look only at the kind of ways that Jungians and people who think they're Jungians these days populate things with these reified images. In other words, avatars.
Yeah.
So we have to go deeper than that. We have to get off the way that Jungian psychology has been turned into pop psychology these days. And Jung was familiar with India. He had more of a problem with India than he did with accepting China via Western people who had studied it. His experience of the East was limited, very, very limited in a personal sense. It was third party. It was by proxy. It was vicarious. And I'm not criticizing him. There's a paradox, because we can all access the truth that is beneath all of these surface structure representations.
Well, yes, because that gets beyond the individual personality beyond as well.
It does.
Doesn't it?
So he was more familiar with China than he was with India, and he was more familiar with both through third parties than apparent direct experience on the surface. And where his real strength came in was that he was a pioneer. So when he talked about the collective unconscious, he was putting into words and into concepts things that he had experienced himself individually at the deepest of levels. Then when it comes to communicating that and representing it to others, it gets turned into ideas. And part of the problem of the West is that ideas are more important than experience. Ideas have become more important than action. And that is how and why we reify things. That's why the ego tends to see the unconscious as if the unconscious were a psychosocial relationship in the outer world. And it is not the same domain at all. So this is what we're saying basically, is that if we can find the way, and there are ways, to access the deepest parts of that collective field, which at one level looks like Jung's collective unconscious, but is deeper even than that, then you will start to make changes. And you will be able to meet with people who have a completely different view to you. And you can share a common language, which is not cognitive, but is based on affect and what people call spirituality and the transcendence in its truest sense. So there's the paradox then. Jung did not really understand India or China on the surface. But what he did do is understand the commonality that united them with the West. So as George Engels says, where you think you stand determines what you think you see. And a lot of the people who follow Jung these days think they know where they stand and they think they know what they see. But they're moving around in a world of constructs and ideas which is superficial and lack personal experience. So there are ways of doing this. So yes, you start to make a change yourself by approaching the field as it represents in another qualia of consciousness from within, and then start action in the world based on the insights that you gain. Other people will be doing the same things, even if they don't model it in the same way. And at that point, the field will start to accommodate you locally in the sense of around you. People will become interested in what you're doing, what you have to say, what your ambitions and goals are. And that will have field resonance with others, and then cultures will start to change. That's how it works. We've been through this before in history, as you've described, James. There have been periods of renaissance before. But now things will happen relatively quickly because of the way that information spreads externally through media like the internet. But one of the fastest ways of communicating is internally, if you do it in the right way, with a field connection to others. But it has to be in the right way.
It does. I don't want to stay on mythology for too long, but I'm going to say next because it's been something that's resonated with me personally very, very deeply. I always had an interest, let's say, in the Arthurian canon, as you've mentioned, Steve. And I remember years ago I was discussing the Grail myth with both of you guys, and I didn't understand, even when told what the answer to the Grail question was, I still didn't understand it. So probably the most clear answer to the Grail question is from the movie Excalibur.
Yeah.
Whom does the Grail serve? The king. And what is the secret of the Grail? You and the land are one. I didn't understand that on an affect level, and that was the problem. So, you and the land are one. Well, I suppose you kind of are. I was kind of thinking about it. I wasn't, and I'm not saying I am now, but I'm certainly further along than I was. I think that's fair to say. And obviously the you and the land are one stuff, and this is based on your guys' recommendation of Roger Sherman Loomis. And I've learned that those Grail legends are ancient, and they've been transformed and changed. First of all, back from Anglo-Norman to Wales to Ireland, and God knows how old the actual original stories are. And the king was always linked to the land. And whenever the king got sick, who was then turned into the Fisher King, the wounded king in the Grail Castle, well, the land went with it. And including other things too, the things got terrible, plagues, let's say, fertility rates dropping, all other kinds of things are described alongside that. But the king and the land being one is something that you guys have said before is akin to what is within, so too is without. It's like George Engels' hierarchy, biopsychosocial, and it requires action. And it's all of those things put together. And when I felt into that, being like, yeah, we're not alone, ever alone. There is always a field that's connecting all of us, not just to individual human beings, especially not just us to say a sick culture, but to the land itself, to history itself, ancestry itself, even the mythology of the land, all of that put together. And it's like, you and the land are one. That when I felt into that a while ago, it was like, I understand at the very least to a degree that's feels significant, that is definitely right. And perhaps other people can resonate with that too.
It's a superpositioning phenomenon as well. And the king actually represents the personal ego on an individual level, the king or the queen, because they are interchangeable in that sense, obviously. So the king is the ego of the culture. It represents the collective in its relationship to the environment. But on an individual level, we have our own land, our own relationship to the world. It isn't just the land, it is the entire world. And if you take it as being like that, then you're suddenly aware of everything that's going on around you, which we call superpositioning. And the East would have different names for it, but we would make the same observation, that becoming conscious of all of those different interconnections, that for someone who understood the Hindu Dharma would be to have a perspective on Indra's net, which is a universal web of interconnected lines and vertices that at the corner has either a mirror or a diamond at each one, but it goes on forever. And each moment in time is reflected in each and reflected to each other. There is a universal connectedness, and that's an intuition which they had, which you can find in many, many other religions, and it's even emerging in science, in the more metaphysical side of science. But you can certainly find echoes of that inside people's psyche at the deepest level, in terms of a harmonic resonance between themselves and their environment. And the normal collapsed ego, which has been overdetermined by other people, by cultural influences, is the first thing to be separated off from that natural mind. So recovering that is very, very important.
And if we all do the right thing, things will get better.
Yeah. It actually doesn't take all of us. It takes some of us. But those who are chosen, shall I say, by fate to do it, have to do it. And there'll be plenty who won't do it. And those who can, must, and they will feel that impetus to do it.
Probably feel that they can't not.
Yeah.
And life can get very difficult, life can get in the way, but that calling will never go away. Calling to not necessarily be something more, but to at the very least not be corrupted by what's going on.
We are all appealing to the individual viewer here, particularly those who are in the most distress, really, when you think about it. I mean, I was thinking about the illusion of complexes, and there's so much OCD out there.
Yeah.
I was thinking about those kinds of things, and how to help people get away from that kind of locked in mindset, that cognitive loop that keeps them from experiencing all these healing dynamics that we've been talking about.
Well, creativity is something that is either artificial or it comes from within. And when it comes from within, then by definition, it's not from the ego. And where then does it come from? My own view is that it's certainly, as Jung would have taken it to be, something that comes from what he called the unconscious, and preferably the collective unconscious. So if we take that as a given, then it means also that it comes from the genome, and it comes from the ancestral psyche, and it comes from the collective field, which is immanent within that. So the solution to contemporary problems will probably turn up amongst artists quite naturally, and we should look for this. And we should look for the resistance against that would come from the catabolic forces, because they will want to eliminate creativity in all of its forms. And that would range from the free expression of thought and speech down to what is allowed and what is not allowed as forms of media. So if we look for where the repression is acting, we'll probably also find where the compensation is coming through, because the repression actually helps it. This is at the cultural level. So it's analogous with this, and we can find this in our individual lives. When we're suffering from a neurosis, there's usually a kickback at some point where the neurosis begins to ramp itself up to force us apparently to stay aligned with it. And that's something that we can all probably agree with, and we've seen it in other people, but there is a secret positive in that. That once the neurosis kicks into that extent, it's threatened, but also it's an impetus from within the neurosis to correct for it, because homeostasis is still present within the field of us as an individual. And that field will be pushing us to confront and to utilize the energy of our neurosis to reverse its polarity. The same things happen in culture. So with respect to creativity, then we should expect repression and expression to be in apparent antagonistic relationship to one another simultaneously. But some people will give in, but some people won't. The ones that won't will be to some extent reactionary only. So that creativity performs a certain function because it draws attention to itself from the negative forces. But there'll be other people who will not be so obvious about their creativity, but will nevertheless generate it. And that's probably the most important form of creativity at times like this, because that creativity will be linked into the positive side of the field, and it will suddenly break out everywhere, or at least it will be distributed sufficiently to begin the process collectively of reversal. And then the people who are fighting valiantly, but in the wrong way, will serve a purpose, because that will draw the bolt, that will draw the lightning bolt of the repression, whilst the rest of the system, the rest of the field starts to configure itself ready for the reversal. So even those who struggle in the wrong way are part of it. They're part of the enantiodromia and part of the change. Now, down on an individual level, then creativity, because it is so natural, when it is natural, brings forth what is needed for an individual to change. If that person then connects with that material, they will find within them the symbols forming for the necessary change in the culture as well. So I would definitely say creativity is massively important. And we have seen this historically. The Italian Renaissance was full of art that at first was quite heavily constricted by the religious zeitgeist of the times. Gradually, though, it broke through. And this is the way, for example, the Green Man is spoken about in the Gawain poem, the original poem, in the oral traditions and in the interpretation since, that a church should be made of grey stone. There should be nothing green. Green is what grows. It's contradictory to that which is old, is hard and grey and dull. But these little shoots grow through it. And there you see them in the medieval churches, the leaf head motif growing out of the green, out of the grey stone. Now, that wasn't in contradiction to the rather oppressive Christianity of the time, not in contradiction, but in compensation for the wider field, for what people were actually doing. And in that sense, it was a preparation for things that came later, when Christianity adjusted to things like science, adjusted to the Enlightenment and the Romantic Age and the scientific revolution and so forth. It was being the preparation for that. The natural world was beginning to grow through the grey stone. Now, things are happening faster now because information is moving in an extrinsic sense much faster than it's ever done before. So we can start to look for things like that occurring, and we can start to look for it being misdirected and perverted into a catabolic state. The green movement is great. It's a great idea, and we should look after the earth, and Gaia is a wonderful idea. And Paul and I were around at the beginning of that, and we were involved in it. We were involved in supporting Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth when they first got going and things like that. But the direction that they've gone in has been corrupted politically. So the catabolic processes have co-opted them. That's a pressure test. Who amongst those who believe and think in a natural way about the world have enough insight and creativity to understand what's happened objectively, about how that desire to keep the earth as a living cauldron of life going without that political catabolic force which is attempting to cap it by misdirection. And the solution will not come from people who are politically engaged. It'll come from creative people. And it will come from the most creative psychotherapists, because they're the people, if they are depth psychologists, who are working in sufficient depth to find that common universal human ground. But if they do so because they're politically orientated in whatever direction, then they're going to corrupt that which would otherwise come through. The Adlerian element will be there. And that is clear. You can see it. You can see it in a lot of Jungians, sadly, that they have become politically polarized to the point where they are ineffective and unrecognizable. And I'm absolutely sure that Jung would, if he were alive now or could see them, would completely dissociate himself from them. Yeah. But they occupy those niche spaces and they misdirect towards catabolism because of Adler, the corrupted and debased form of Adler that's coming through them. But those psychotherapists who are not encumbered with that and who can see and feel into depth are going to be able to reach the creativity in individuals and to help them. But there'll be people who do not need psychotherapists, who are naturally plugged into this. And there'll be other people who are spiritual and religious and have never heard of Carl Jung and don't think of themselves as creative, but they find another way in. But that's still creative, because creativity is the linking of that which is so deeply within. It's also without and within everybody else. In other words, it is the objective waveform of the informational field as we would model it. So creativity is vitally important. It gets us outside of our ego. It gets us away from the influence of others. That's why creativity is such a threat to anything which is catabolic and destructive.
Yeah, well, a political psychotherapist particularly, I have to say, is a disgusting thing.
It is. Yeah.
And I think you're right to say, Steve, that if people are engaged with their creativity properly, they wouldn't even need to consider the idea of having counseling or psychotherapy. They would naturally reach in and discover their own potential, and they would just adjust themselves. So I think what you're saying really is that for there to be a renaissance now, we would have to literally cut ourselves adrift from any kind of political influence, cast our minds back over the past, over the centuries, and bring forward that which was, because this is what happens with any kind of a renaissance or rebirth. There's a reappraisal of what was good and wholesome from the past, and a bringing forward of it. But it's only going to be of any value if it hasn't been corrupted by political ideology. And I guess when we do it, whatever we read, whatever we expose ourselves to with respect to our understanding of the past, we have to be absolutely sure that we've actually done that. We've stripped away any kind of political dressing that or matrix that those ideas, those things that are valuable have become embedded in. And then we've got something truly valuable then.
That's so true, Paul, because in effect what we're doing, if this were this culture that we're talking about, that we're examining, this hypothetical culture, if that were an individual person, what that would mean would be the stripping away of complexes which are acquired through suggestion and influence. And that is where Adlerian pathology works. And it's concealed as if it were normal, because there is an adaptive element to it.
There is.
In a Darwinian sense. So there is therefore instinctive pressure for that kind of thing to emerge and to occupy the psychosocial domain. But Adler didn't want it to go wrong. He wanted this to be something where there is social interest, as he called it.
But where there's social interest, naturally there's politics as well. And
unfortunately.
It's where the two collide, isn't it?
And that's where Jung should come in.
It is, absolutely.
But if Adler inflates into Jung and takes a perverted Freudian instinctive drive with it, then say Jung inflates naturally under that kind of pressure and then collapses retrogressively back through Adler and down into the most base and destructive of instincts. And that's what we're seeing. Freud seeks Adler, Adler conceals Freud, Jung inflates and falls victim to both. But there is a way out of that, and we have to access the most fundamental level, creativity, that process of self-discovery and self-creation, and then collective self-discovery and creation. We have to go back to the Platonic. Plato seeks Darwin. Darwin conceals Plato. The soul transcends and unites them both. And at that point, then, we'll have a proper spiritual transcendence, a true renaissance.
I'd like to comment briefly on the creativity side, if that's okay. Because you mentioned the Italian Renaissance in there as well. And this is something that we've spoken about before, but again, this is partly from personal experience, but I think a lot of people will be able to resonate with this. School, university, et al., any kind of formal education, it seems is utterly insistent to want to two things. One, destroy creativity in people, outright gone, and another is to restrict the potential of people whilst also giving a facade that they're doing very, very, very well in terms of their genomic bandwidth. Do that through giving status in the way that everything is very, very streamlined. So you niche down enormously specially, and then that's who you are in persona and in identity and in everything else. But that was not the way of the past, was it? If we look back to the Renaissance times, the people who would perhaps now be, say, the top academics would also be highly creative and certainly polymaths. Yes. And the real, say, academic ideal, if we go with academic, back to, say, Plato's Academy, it would be a polymath. And because the genome of each individual person is capable of being a polymath, certainly insofar as it's not restricted in the way things are now in the culture. So I guess I'm speaking to anyone at the moment in the audience, perhaps is more intellectually inclined, because that's also me too. Certainly was me even more in the past. But it does feel very liberating and so true to not have to restrict yourself just down to one small avenue of life. And we could even, God forbid, to some degree, we can even bring in a typological model into that if we do so choose. Just like you guys have said, that the idea that some people are a thinking type or a sensing type or whatever, that can be true for some people some of the time, but really they're capable of using all of their functions. They're all options. Why would biology limit such a thing? That would limit the potential of each person. So perhaps there's a lot more potential, genuine potential in each individual person than the culture has hitherto let on. And in the way that it does encourage that to come out of people, it will twist it and lie about it and say you have to be one certain way or another. But the Platonic field that you guys are mentioning will insist otherwise. And the Platonic nature of a human being is far more dynamic than that. We know that that's true from history.
Yes. Oh, sorry, Paul.
No, it's okay. I was just going to quickly add to that. It's better for homeostasis, and you're right that the education system is set up and has been set up for a long time to create that kind of polarity in terms of even down to the kind of academic subjects that young people are forced to choose, say when they get to GCSE level. You know, it certainly was that way in our day too, that do you do the arts or you do the sciences, but you can't do both. You have to make a selection. And I think you're saying that really they are inseparable, and they should be inseparable. Yeah. And where you know, individuals have the opportunity to learn about all things and to see how everything fits together, that has to be better for their overall education and their overall homeostasis. And as we've said today, you also see what goes wrong when there is an emphasis of one over the other in the culture. So with the age of reason and the scientific rationalism and the preference for hard sciences, for maths and physics and so on, over the arts and the humanities, actually brought about the enantiodromy that meant that we then had a period in history where suddenly the arts and humanities became important again. There was a shift back in that direction. So whether it's at the individual or the cultural level, the way out of that, the way to prevent that kind of sort of movement forwards and backwards is to integrate everything into our learning. And if only our educational systems were such that they would do that now, that would be a wonderful thing. But we know that they're in service of something else, which is really rather unpleasant, and probably education is the last thing on the list. But you're absolutely right, that we should all be aspiring to that.
We should all be polymaths and autodidacts.
Yes, yeah.
We should be. Otherwise, how can we optimize our potential?
Yeah. Yes.
We should never stop.
Yeah. Otherwise, it's like you say, James, you can see how somebody would then fall victim to something like typology, because it'd be like, oh, well, I've now classified myself as a thinking type, or an INTP or J, or whatever it happens to be. Therefore, I don't have any feeling for people. I don't have any relational skills. I'm not going to be any good at doing, whatever. And, obviously you can fill in the blanks yourself. But you're right, that we then becomes such a persuasive idea that it prevents us from trying different things. And there's everything in life, everything it sort of revolves around suggestion and influence, and just how much we buy into it. And the degree to which we don't, I think, is a metric of really just how individuated we are. Because then we can say, well, no, I'm not going to be, I'm being exposed to ideas which I know are harmful. I'm going to dissociate myself from those. I'm not going to have anything to do with them. And that's massively ego strengthening. And we often say, don't we, Steve, that ego strength really is a metric of just how balanced we are. It is our homeostasis.
Yeah.
So I think you're absolutely right. I think we should all aspire to be polymaths and want to learn diverse things, and encourage one another to do that. I mean, you've certainly, in our relationship, you've done that for me, and hopefully vice versa. And,
of course.
Always
been that way.
It's always been that way. Yeah.
That's one of the, I don't even want to call it an idea, but for a moment I will. It's one of the ideas I've personally found the most inspiring and true and real. There are a lot of suggestions that say on the internet that are completely and utterly wrong, but they might be partially okay, and you look to see who might be spouting certain ideas, and they might be certain professors or high-ranking intellectuals, very, very, very focused on thinking, and then they might come out with absolutely ludicrous but so subtly immensely damaging suggestions that do so much harm to people, like creativity is not for everyone, it's only for the very few. In that one single suggestion, you've just limited 1 million people's potential
easily.
Yes, you have.
But that feeling that people are more than they believe themselves to be, and more than they've been taught to be, in other words, that they can become who they truly are, is at least for me, it's been the most profound on an affect level that I've ever experienced.
Yeah, absolutely. We have to be very careful who we allow to influence us, because most people won't influence us in a very positive way.
So, I mean, that's what complexes do, isn't it,
I was just going to say
Sorry,
that.
yes,
No,
that's how they operate,
please go ahead.
Well, it is. It's how they operate.
Yeah.
I mean, the minute that you realize that, and it is, we go back to what we were talking about at the very beginning with the Mahabharata, and the idea of the kind of illusions that the ego creates. Well, complexes largely are illusory. But the minute that you can see through them and through their persuasive power, they have no power over you again. It's done, it's finished, it's over.
Yeah. That was what Arjuna said when he was confronted by Krishna with the most terrible of polarities, but they were the same thing.
Yes.
And he said, can you look at a heap of soil and a pile of gold with the same eye and see that they're the same thing? And that's obviously a polarity. And the Western mind would see it as that and would look at the gold, and the gold's more important than a pile of earth. Can't grow anything in a pile of gold. But if you try and exchange earth for something, gold is a better form of exchange. So it depends how you look at things at one level when we want to make divisions between that which is important at the deepest level. But he was showing or revealing to Arjuna what an illusion actually was. And he said, Arjuna, in response to the teaching that he received, Vishnu calls the most secret teaching, that all his illusions had fallen away one by one, and he'd seen everything as it was, and everything was interconnected and interrelated. And then he felt capable of acting, because it's polarity that prevents us from acting. It's neurosis that prevents us from acting, because neurosis is a split that creates a space in between that we fall down into as a singularity, and we sit there. That's the problem. Yeah. And fantasy, which is illusion, is such a trap.
I found really one of the most moving parts of that, Steve, is when Krishna says to Arjuna, "You are loved."
Yes.
It's such a simple thing, isn't it, to say, but that unpacks into something so profound that it moves you beyond polarity, it moves you beyond complexes. Yeah. To something much more deeper and meaningful. And,
it does.
I just found the simplicity of that, but the profundity of that extremely moving.
Yeah. It is. It is. Cognitive therapists, I bash them all the time, bless them, but they deal in the generation of opposition. Jungians, when they are being particularly stupid, do the same thing. Everything's an opposite. They've gone about the opposites. That's a huge mistake. The solution to wrong thinking is not right thinking, it's right feeling. And that right feeling will often emerge from right action. There is a sense of reward for doing the right thing. That sense of reward isn't only hormonal, it comes from your genome, it's gene expression, it's part of the homeostatic regulation of the entire system. It's also a field effect, because when people feel better, other people feel better around them. And then there's a reciprocal field effect back to us, because we've done the right thing and we feel good about doing that. You reverse the polarity on that, and you start to feel bad about things, and other people feel bad around you. And then the whole field starts to shift in the catabolic direction. Influence is energy and information, and the exchange of those factors between people, between organizations, even across time. So we have to know how to feel properly about things. And feeling is affect. Affect is the carrier wave of instinct. Instinct is the intentionality of the genome and of the Sheldrakean and Platonic fields. But as Pauline said, the simplicity of how Krishna communicates that to Arjuna is more profound than everything I've just said. For the Western mind, it needs that kind of understanding in layers. For the profound Eastern Indian mind, then it's all about seeing and feeling everything appropriately in the moment and knowing our place in that and acting accordingly. Action in the world.
As individuals and as a culture, we have the capacity to reconcile the apparent disconnect between Darwin and Plato, between the material and the transcendent. Only through the lens of cultural neurosis do they appear as opposites. Only through premature subjective waveform collapse do they appear discrete and different. In reality, they are both united in the meta-instincts, and hence the living out of full potential. The meta-instincts are evolved, and they are Platonic. They are the informed representation of homeostasis, for people, par excellence. The train track shift from Dark Age to Renaissance has happened before, and this is why it will happen again. It is the intentionality of the Platonic field for it to be so.